Homeless and haggard from 3 tours in Afghanistan, Rachel Calloway stood at the bottom of the grand marble staircase leading to the attic of Rosewood Manor, her weathered hands gripping the polished banister. The mansion loomed around her, a sprawling testament to old money that made her feel even more out of place in her faded army surplus jacket and worn boots. Looking up into the shadowy darkness of the 3rd floor, she couldn't help but wonder how her life had led her here. A decorated veteran reduced to odd jobs just to survive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 38, Rachel never imagined she'd be cleaning rich people's attics to earn enough for a bed at the shelter. After serving her country with distinction as an Army Ranger, earning a Purple Heart and multiple commendations for valor, she'd returned home to find her husband gone, their savings depleted, and her mind haunted by the things she'd seen in combat. PTSD had made holding down a steady job impossible. The nightmares, the sudden panic attacks, the inability to function. In crowded places, all of it had slowly stripped away the life she'd once known. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, Sergeant Rachel Calloway, who had led special operations in some of the most dangerous territories in the Middle East, was now reduced to manual labor in the home of Eleanor Harrington, one of Boston's wealthiest widows. The Veterans Affairs Office had connected her with this temporary work program, a last-ditch effort to help homeless veterans find stability. Even this opportunity had come with humiliating conditions. Rachel had been required to submit to a drug test and background check, as if her military service record wasn't enough to establish her character. Rosewood Manor stretched before her like a museum of privilege. From her vantage point at the base of the stairs, Rachel could see gleaming hardwood floors, walls adorned with original artwork, and furniture that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire military career. The contrast with the shelter where she'd spent the last 6 months, a crowded, dingy place with narrow cots and shared bathrooms, couldn't have been starker. Mrs. Harrington requests that you limit your activities to the attic spaces only. The housekeeper, Miss Perry, had informed Rachel that morning with barely disguised disdain. You're to sort through the accumulated items, discard what's clearly trash, and organize the rest for Mrs. Harrington's later review. Under no circumstances are you to remove anything from the premises. The warning had been unnecessary. Despite her desperate circumstances, Rachel still held onto the core values that had guided her military service: honor, integrity, and duty. She wasn't a thief, regardless of what the housekeeper's suspicious glances implied. The staircase, too. The attic was steep and narrow, a stark contrast to the grand, sweeping main staircase that connected the mansion's 1st and 2nd floors. This was clearly a servant's passage, not meant to be seen by the elite visitors who frequented Rosewood Manor. Each step creaked under Rachel's weight, announcing her intrusion into spaces that had likely remained undisturbed for years. At the top, a heavy oak door with a tarnished brass handle stood between Rachel and her day's work. She pushed it open, wincing at the loud groan of neglected hinges. Dust motes danced in the weak beams of light that filtered through 2 small dormer windows. The air was stale, carrying the musty scent of forgotten things and forgotten times. Just like clearing a compound, Rachel muttered to herself, falling back on the tactical language that had structured her life for so many years. Systematic search pattern. Identify threats and assets. Maintain situational awareness. The military patter was a coping mechanism, a way to ground herself when the anxiety threatened to take over. Her therapist at the VA had suggested it, finding ways to apply her military training to civilian situations as a bridge between her 2 worlds. Sometimes it helped, sometimes nothing did. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The attic was massive, stretching nearly the entire length of the mansion's third floor. Decades of the Harrington family's cast-offs created a labyrinth of furniture draped in yellowed sheets. Stacks of leather-bound books, trunks and boxes and paintings leaned against walls. Everything was arranged with a haphazard logic that suggested multiple generations had contributed to the collection, each adding their unwanted possessions without bothering to organize what had come before. Rachel moved deeper into the space, careful not to disturb the delicate equilibrium of stacked objects. Her military training had taught her to move with precision, even in chaotic environments, a skill that served her well now. As she navigated through the maze of forgotten wealth, she couldn't help but think about the disparity between her life and the Harringtons. What must it be like to have so much that you could simply forget about rooms full of valuables? According to Ms. Perry, Eleanor Harrington was the last of her family line. Her husband, Richard, had died 5 years ago, and their only son had been killed in a sailing accident in his 20s. Mrs. Harrington, now in her 70s, lived alone in the sprawling mansion with only her staff for company. The attic cleaning project had been initiated because the elderly woman had suddenly developed an interest in family history, wanting to catalog what remained of previous generations before determining what should be preserved. Probably getting her affairs in order, Miss Perry had said with a grim satisfaction that suggested she didn't expect to be remembered in the will. When the rich get old, they start thinking about their legacy. Legacy was something Rachel understood. In the military, your legacy was measured in lives saved, missions completed, sacrifices made for a greater purpose. She wondered what Eleanor Harrington's legacy would be beyond this accumulation of expensive things, gathering dust in a forgotten attic. A large steamer trunk dominated one corner of the attic, its brass fittings tarnished but still solid. The trunk appeared older than the surrounding items, with a craftsmanship that spoke of European origin rather than American manufacturing. Rachel approached it carefully, noting that unlike many of the other pieces, this trunk showed signs of recent attention. The dust layer was thinner, and the floor around it bore scuff marks suggesting it had been moved in the last few months. "Start with the obvious anomalies," she murmured, another fragment of her training surfacing as she approached the trunk. In hostile territory, anything that didn't fit the pattern was potentially significant. Here, in this mausoleum of wealth, the recently disturbed trunk stood out like a flare in the night sky. The trunk was locked, a heavy padlock securing its brass latches. Rachel frowned. Miss Perry had given her a ring of keys that supposedly opened any locked furniture in the attic, but a quick check confirmed none matched this particular lock. She made a mental note to ask about it later and continued her survey of the space. Hours passed as Rachel methodically worked through the attic, creating organized piles, items that appeared valuable or historically significant, everyday objects in good condition, damaged goods that might be restorable, and clear garbage. The work was physically demanding but mentally soothing. The repetitive actions of lifting, sorting, and arranging required just enough concentration to quiet the chaos in her mind without triggering her anxiety. By mid-afternoon, she had cleared a significant section of the attic and established a better understanding of what she was dealing with. The Harrington family history was written in these discarded possessions, furniture that tracked changing styles across decades, clothing that mapped the evolution of fashion, books and papers, that revealed the family's interests and connections. It was an archaeological dig through American wealth, layer upon layer of prosperity that had allowed this family to discard items that would have been treasured, heirlooms in less fortunate households. Rachel was carefully wrapping a collection of hand-painted porcelain when a sound from the stairwell made her freeze. Years in combat zones had honed her senses to detect even the slightest disturbance. Someone was ascending the stairs with slow, deliberate steps, not the brisk efficiency of Miss Perry or the other staff members. She remained perfectly still, her body instinctively shifting into a defensive posture. The door creaked open to reveal a slender woman in her 70s, dressed in an elegantly tailored navy dress that contrasted sharply with her silver hair. Eleanor Harrington herself had come to inspect the progress. "Mrs. Harrington," Rachel acknowledged, straightening up and brushing dust from her hands. "I wasn't expecting you to check the work personally." Eleanor Harrington surveyed the organized piles with piercing blue eyes that missed nothing. "I prefer to oversee important matters myself, Miss Calloway. The VA spoke highly of your attention to detail. I see they weren't exaggerating." Rachel wasn't sure how to respond to the compliment, if it was indeed intended as such. The wealthy widow's tone remained neutral, revealing neither approval nor disapproval. "I've been working systematically from east to west," Rachel explained, falling back on the clear communication patterns of military briefings. "I've identified several items that appear to have significant historical or monetary value." She gestured to the carefully arranged pile of objects she had deemed worth preserving. Eleanor moved further into the attic, her gaze lingering on the locked trunk Rachel had noted earlier. A flicker of something concern, anxiety, crossed her features before her expression returned to aristocratic neutrality. "You've noticed the Bavarian trunk," she observed, her voice carefully modulated. "Yes, ma'am. It's locked, and none of the keys I was given fit it." Eleanor's hand went to a thin gold chain around her neck, from which a small key hung alongside a pendant. "That's because I keep the key with me at all times. The trunk contains personal papers and family documents that require discretion." The explanation made sense, yet Rachel's instincts, the same ones that had kept her alive in war zones, detected something off about the widow's reaction. Years of intelligence operations had taught her to recognize when someone was being selective with the truth. "Of course," Rachel replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I'll work around it and leave it for your personal attention." Eleanor seemed to relax slightly. "I appreciate your understanding. The VA office mentioned you served in intelligence operations. That background is partly why I selected you for this task. I need someone who understands the value of discretion." The conversation was taking an unexpected turn. Rachel had assumed she'd been chosen for this job because she was available and desperate, not because of her specific military background. "Miss Perry tells me you're staying at the Veterans Haven shelter downtown," Eleanor continued, her gaze sweeping over Rachel's worn clothing. "That must be quite challenging after the structured environment of military service." "I'm grateful for the bed, ma'am," Rachel answered diplomatically, uncomfortable with discussing her circumstances with this wealthy woman. Pride was one of the few possessions she had left. Eleanor nodded, as if Rachel had confirmed something important. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Calloway. This attic project is more extensive than I initially estimated. Rather than having you travel back and forth from the shelter, I'd like to offer you temporary accommodation in the servants' quarters for the duration of the job. You'd have a private room, meals provided, and a slightly increased daily rate for your work." The offer was unexpected and suspiciously generous. Rachel's tactical mind immediately began assessing potential motives. Was Eleanor Harrington simply being charitable to a homeless veteran? Or did she want Rachel close by for some other reason? "That's very kind, Mrs. Harrington, but it's not kindness, Miss Calloway. It's practicality. Having you on site will expedite the project and ensure security. The servants' quarters are currently unoccupied, except for Miss Perry, who has her own apartment in the East Wing. You'd have privacy and considerably more comfort than I imagine the shelter provides. Think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. Put that way, the offer was difficult to refuse. Rachel's current situation at the shelter was untenable. Long-term, the constant noise, lack of privacy, and strict entry and exit times all exacerbated her PTSD symptoms. A private room, even in someone else's home, would be a significant improvement. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. I accept your offer," Rachel said finally. "Excellent. Miss Perry will show you to your accommodations when you're ready to end work. For today, I'll have someone collect your belongings from the shelter." Rachel almost laughed at that. "That won't be necessary. Everything I own is in my backpack downstairs." Something that might have been sympathy flickered across Eleanor's aristocratic features. "I see. Well then, that simplifies matters." The elderly woman turned to leave but paused at the locked trunk, her hand again going to the key around her neck. "Miss Calloway, I should mention that some family matters are best left buried in the past. This house has stood for nearly 2 centuries, and its attics contain more than just forgotten furniture. They contain secrets, some benign, others complicated. I would appreciate your discretion regarding anything unusual you might discover." Before Rachel could respond to this cryptic warning, Eleanor was gone, descending the narrow staircase with surprising agility for her age. The encounter left Rachel unsettled. Her years in military intelligence had trained her to recognize when someone was hiding something significant. Eleanor Harrington was definitely concealing something connected to that locked Bavarian trunk. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dormer windows, Rachel returned to her work with renewed focus. But now she paid closer attention to anything that might indicate what Eleanor was so concerned about. She began examining objects not just for their value or condition, but for what they might reveal about the Harrington family's secrets. Near the back wall, partially hidden behind a rolled Persian carpet, Rachel discovered a stack of framed photographs that had been deliberately placed face down. Unlike most items in the attic, these showed signs of intentional concealment rather than simple neglect. Carefully, she turned over the first frame. The black and white photograph showed a younger Eleanor, perhaps in her 20s, standing beside a stern-looking older man in what appeared to be a European setting. The man wore an expensive suit with a distinctive pin on his lapel, one that Rachel recognized from her military history training as a symbol associated with wealthy American industrialists who had maintained business relationships with Nazi Germany before and sometimes even during the war. Rachel's pulse quickened as she examined the remaining photographs. Several showed the same man, presumably Eleanor's father or another relative, meeting with German businessmen in the 1930s. One particularly troubling image captured him shaking hands with a high-ranking Nazi official whose face was partially obscured but still recognizable to anyone familiar with Third Reich leadership. These weren't the innocent family photographs of tourists visiting pre-war Germany. These were documentation of business relationships with the Nazi regime, relationships that many American companies had later gone to great lengths to downplay or erase from their histories after the war's atrocities came to light. Rachel carefully replaced the photographs exactly as she had found them, her mind racing with implications. The Harrington family wealth, the Bavarian trunk that Eleanor kept locked with a key she wore around her neck, the widow's cryptic warning about family secrets best left buried, they were all connecting into a disturbing pattern. As the day's light began to fade and dust motes danced in the dying sunbeams, Rachel made her way back to the locked trunk. She circled it slowly, examining its craftsmanship more carefully. The trunk's hardware included decorative elements she now recognized as subtly incorporating symbolism from 1930s Germany. This wasn't just any European antique. This was specifically German, from a very particular and infamous period. "What are you hiding, Eleanor?" Rachel whispered to the empty attic, her tactical mind already formulating theories and potential courses of action. The sound of Miss Perry calling her name from the bottom of the attic stairs interrupted her thoughts. It was time to see her new accommodations and end the first day of what had suddenly become much more than a simple attic cleaning job. Rachel had entered Rosewood Manor as a homeless veteran desperate for work. Now she found herself in the opening stages of what felt increasingly like an intelligence operation, one centered on uncovering whatever dark secret Eleanor Harrington was protecting in that locked Bavarian trunk. Rachel was shown to a small but comfortable room in the servants' wing of Rosewood Manor. The space was modest compared to the opulence of the main house, but after months in the shelter, it felt like luxury. A single bed with clean linens, a private bathroom with actual hot water, a writing desk beside a window overlooking the garden. These simple amenities nearly brought tears to her eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. As she unpacked her meager belongings, Rachel's mind remained fixated on the disturbing discoveries in the attic. The Harrington family apparently had connections to Nazi Germany, connections that Eleanor was taking great pains to conceal. The locked Bavarian trunk likely contained evidence of these relationships, perhaps documentation that could damage the family's reputation or even expose criminal activities. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, considering her options. Her military training urged caution and further intelligence gathering before taking any action. Jumping to conclusions based on a few photographs and a suspicious trunk would be unprofessional. Yet her moral compass, the same one that had guided her through the ethical complexities of modern warfare, wouldn't allow her to simply ignore potential evidence of collaboration with one of history's most evil regimes. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams filled with fragmented images of war zones, both past and imagined, the dusty streets of Kandahar blending seamlessly into nightmarish visions of Nazi Germany. She woke before dawn, her body still operating on military time despite years of civilian life. The pre-dawn quiet of the massive house was comforting, reminding her of early mornings on base before the daily chaos began. After a quick shower, her first truly private bathing experience in months, Rachel made her way to the kitchen. She found Miss Perry already there, preparing coffee with practiced efficiency. "You're up early," the housekeeper observed, her tone suggesting this was a point in Rachel's favor. "Hard to break the habit," Rachel replied, accepting the offered cup of coffee with genuine gratitude. "Military schedule sticks with you." Miss Perry nodded, her previous coolness softening slightly. "My father was in Korea, said he never slept past 5 a.m. again, even after 40 years as a civilian." This small connection, the shared understanding of how military service reshapes a person's life, created a momentary bridge between them. Rachel seized the opportunity to gather more information. "I noticed a lot of European items in the attic. Yesterday, the Harringtons traveled extensively?" Miss Perry's expression became guarded. "The family has always had international connections. Mr. Harrington Sr., that would be. Mrs. Harrington's father-in-law was in banking and investments. Did considerable business overseas before and after the war." "Before and after," Rachel noted carefully. "But not during?" The housekeeper's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mrs. Harrington prefers that staff not discuss family history with outsiders." "Of course." "I apologize." Rachel backed off immediately, recognizing she'd pushed too far too quickly. "I just find historical context helpful when organizing artifacts. Helps me understand what might be valuable versus what's just old." Miss Perry seemed to accept this explanation, but the momentary warmth had dissipated. "Mrs. Harrington will be out today, attending a hospital board meeting. She expects you to continue the attic work without supervision. I'll bring lunch up at noon." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Left alone after breakfast, Rachel returned to the attic with a clearer objective than simple organization. Today, she would search systematically for any additional evidence of the Harrington family's Nazi connections while continuing her assigned task. The combination of her intelligence background and her current desperate circumstances created a moral dilemma she couldn't ignore. If Eleanor Harrington was indeed hiding Nazi gold or other assets looted during the Holocaust, did Rachel have An obligation to expose this? Or was her duty simply to complete the job she'd been hired to do, securing the temporary stability it offered? The military had clear chains of command and rules of engagement. Civilian life, she'd discovered, rarely offered such clarity. Rachel resumed her methodical sorting, working her way toward the area near the suspicious trunk. She paid special attention to anything that might have European, particularly German, origins. Several hours into her work, she discovered a hidden compartment in an antique secretary desk she'd been cataloging. The compartment was expertly crafted, visible only when the desk was examined from a specific angle. Inside, she found a leather-bound ledger with entries dating from 1938 to 1945. Ledger was written in a combination of English and German, documenting transactions between Harrington Banking and Trust and various German industrial firms, many of which Rachel recognized as companies that had used slave labor from concentration camps. More disturbing were entries from 1939 to 1941, the period when the United States was officially neutral, but Germany was already occupying much of Europe. These pages detailed the movement of assets from Jewish-owned businesses in occupied territories to accounts controlled by Harrington interests. The language was deliberately obscure, using euphemisms like acquired under favorable conditions and ownership transfer due to emigration circumstances, but the implications were clear. Rachel photographed several pages with her phone, careful to replace the ledger exactly as she'd found it. This was concrete evidence that the Harrington family fortune had been built, at least in part, on assets stolen from Holocaust victims. As noon approached, she heard Miss Perry's footsteps on the attic stairs and quickly moved away from the secretary desk, resuming her sorting work as if nothing had happened. The housekeeper delivered a sandwich and bottled water without comment, her manner professional but distant. Mrs. Harrington called, Miss Perry informed her before leaving. She wanted to ensure you're comfortable with your accommodations. Very comfortable, thank you, Rachel replied. Please tell her I'm grateful for the arrangement. Once alone again, Rachel continued her dual mission of organizing the attic while searching for additional evidence. By mid-afternoon, she had compiled a disturbing pattern: correspondence between Harrington Sr. and German business associates that continued well into 1941, financial records showing the influx of European assets during the early war years, and photographs documenting meetings with Nazi officials, thinly disguised as ordinary business relationships. Most tellingly, she found a small notebook containing what appeared to be inventory codes and locations, references to artwork, gold, and other valuables with Swiss bank account numbers beside them. The notebook was dated 1945, suggesting these assets had been moved just as the Nazi regime collapsed. Rachel's heart pounded as the implications became clear. The Harrington fortune wasn't just tainted by business dealings with the Nazi regime, it appeared to include actual looted assets that had never been returned to their rightful owners or their descendants. If the contents of that locked Bavarian trunk confirmed this suspicion, Eleanor Harrington wasn't merely protecting family reputation. She was concealing evidence of war crimes. The weight of this knowledge settled heavily on Rachel's shoulders. As a soldier, she had sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Did that oath extend to exposing historical injustices decades after they occurred? Or was she simply a desperate homeless veteran grasping at conspiracy theories to give meaning to a menial job? As the afternoon light began to fade, Rachel heard the distinctive sound of Eleanor Harrington's voice downstairs, indicating the widow had returned earlier than expected. Footsteps on the main staircase suggested she was coming up, not to the attic but to the second floor where the family bedrooms were located. Making a split-second decision, Rachel quietly left the attic and positioned herself in the shadows of the second-floor hallway. She watched as Eleanor entered the master suite, emerging minutes later with the Bavarian trunk's key in hand. The elderly woman moved with surprising speed toward the attic stairs. Rachel retreated to the servants' staircase, circling back to the attic through a different approach. When she re-entered the workspace, she found Eleanor standing before the trunk, key in hand, unaware of Rachel's presence. "Mrs. Harrington," Rachel said quietly, causing the older woman to startle visibly. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you." Eleanor composed herself quickly, but not before Rachel noticed she had slipped the key back around her neck without opening the trunk. "Miss Calloway, I didn't realize you were still working. It's past 5. I lose track of time easily when—" "I'm focused," Rachel explained, moving closer to where Eleanor stood. "I've made significant progress today. Found some interest in historical documents that might be valuable for your family archives." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, but Rachel noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. "Indeed? Well, I'm glad the work is proceeding efficiently. I came to retrieve something personal from storage, but it can wait until you've finished for the day." Rachel recognized the dismissal but chose to press gently. "Actually, Mrs. Harrington, I wanted to ask about some of the European items I've found. There seems to be a significant collection from Germany, particularly from the 1930s and 40s. Were your family members collectors of German art?" The question was deliberately ambiguous, giving Eleanor room to provide an innocent explanation if one existed. The widow's reaction, however, confirmed Rachel's suspicions. Eleanor's hand went immediately to the key at her throat, her posture stiffening. "My late father-in-law had extensive business interests in Europe," she said carefully. "He acquired various items during his travels. Nothing of particular significance." "I see," Rachel nodded, maintaining a respectful tone while watching Eleanor's body language closely. "I noticed what appears to be a company ledger from that period. Harrington Banking had offices in Europe then." The direct reference to documented evidence caused a visible change in Eleanor's demeanor. The aristocratic composure faltered, replaced by something harder and more calculating. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its polite veneer. "Ms. Calloway, I believe I mentioned that family matters are best left private. Your job is to organize the attic, not investigate my family's business history." "Of course," Rachel backed off verbally while maintaining eye contact. "I apologize if I overstepped. As I mentioned, I find historical context helpful for organization purposes." Eleanor seemed to accept this retreat, but her gaze remained sharp and assessing. "I think you've done enough for today. Please continue tomorrow morning. Ms. Perry will have dinner ready in the kitchen shortly." After Eleanor departed, Rachel remained in the attic for several more minutes, processing the interaction. The widow's reaction had confirmed that she was consciously concealing something significant related to her family's Nazi connections. Whatever was in that Bavarian trunk, Eleanor considered it dangerous enough to warrant personal monitoring and immediate, defensive reactions to even oblique questions. Rachel descended to her room in the servants' quarters, her mind racing with ethical calculations. If the Harrington fortune included assets stolen from Holocaust victims, those assets rightfully belonged to the victims' descendants. Countless families had spent decades seeking restitution for art, gold, and other valuables looted by the Nazis. If Rachel had stumbled upon evidence that could help these families, did she have a moral obligation to act? Dinner was a quiet affair in the kitchen, with Miss Perry providing a simple but excellent meal while maintaining minimal conversation. Rachel sensed that the housekeeper had been instructed to watch her more closely, as the woman seemed to be finding reasons to check on her throughout the evening. Back in her room, Rachel reviewed the photos she'd taken of the ledger and other documents. The evidence was compelling but incomplete. Without seeing the contents of the Bavarian trunk, she couldn't definitively prove that the Harringtons possessed actual looted Nazi assets rather than merely having unsavory business relationships with the regime. She needed to see inside that trunk. The lock would be simple enough to pick with her military training, but accessing the attic without alerting Eleanor or Miss Perry would be challenging. The main house had a security system, and while it was primarily designed to prevent external intrusions, Rachel had noticed motion sensors in the main hallways that would likely activate at night. As she contemplated her options, a soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly hid her phone and opened the door to find Ms. Perry holding a cordless phone. "Call for you," the housekeeper said with obvious surprise. "A Dr. Harrison from the VA." Rachel accepted the phone with confusion. She hadn't given anyone this number. "Hello, Sergeant Calloway," came the familiar voice of her VA psychiatrist. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. Mrs. Harrington contacted our office today to verify some details about your military service record and mentioned you'd accepted temporary accommodation at her property." The statement contained several red flags. While the voice indeed belonged to Dr. Harrison, Rachel's psychiatrist would have no reason to call her about employment verification. More importantly, Eleanor Harrington had specifically mentioned checking Rachel's military service record information that would include her intelligence background. "Yes, doctor," Rachel replied carefully, aware that Ms. Perry remained within earshot. "The arrangement is working well. The accommodations are much better than the shelter." "I'm glad to hear it," Dr. Harrison continued. Mrs. Harrington expressed some concerns about potential PTSD triggers, and her home specifically mentioned some German artifacts that might be problematic given your grandmother's Holocaust background. I assured her that your file doesn't indicate any specific triggers related to Holocaust imagery, but I wanted to check with you directly. Rachel froze momentarily. Her file contained no information about a Jewish grandmother because she didn't have one. This was clearly a coded message. Dr. Harrison was warning her that Eleanor had been asking specifically about potential Jewish connections in Rachel's background. "I appreciate the concern," Rachel replied evenly, "but as you know, my family doesn't have that particular history. My triggers are related to combat experiences, not historical artifacts." "I thought as much," Dr. Harrison said, his tone confirming that he understood her response. "Nevertheless, if anything in your current environment becomes problematic for your recovery, please don't hesitate to contact me directly." "I will. Thank you for checking in." After returning the phone to Ms. Perry, Rachel closed her door and sat on the edge of the bed, processing this new information. Eleanor Harrington wasn't just concerned about Rachel discovering Nazi connections. She was specifically worried about Rachel having personal motivation to expose those connections because of Jewish heritage. The call had confirmed Rachel's suspicions while simultaneously alerting her that Eleanor was actively investigating her background. The situation had escalated from discovering troubling historical evidence to a potential present-day threat. If Eleanor believed Rachel might expose family secrets that could lead to claims against the Harrington fortune, what might the wealthy widow do to prevent that exposure? Rachel's military training kicked in, her mind automatically assessing threat levels and security protocols. She checked her room for potential surveillance, finding none but remaining cautious nonetheless. She needed to act quickly but intelligently. Whatever evidence existed in that Bavarian trunk, she needed to document it before Eleanor had a chance to move or destroy it. The bedside clock showed 9:30 p.m. Miss Perry typically retired to her separate apartment in the East Wing by 10 o'clock. And according to household patterns Rachel had observed, Eleanor rarely left her bedroom after her evening medication at 9 o'clock. If Rachel was going to access the attic unobserved, her window of opportunity would be between 10:30 p.m. and dawn. As she waited, Rachel reviewed everything she knew about the Harrington family's Nazi connections. The ledgers, photographs, and inventory lists painted a damning picture of a banking family that had profited from the Holocaust, likely by helping Nazi officials hide looted assets and transfer them to American ownership as the Third Reich collapsed. If the Bavarian trunk contained the actual stolen items, gold, artwork, or other valuables taken from Holocaust victims, it would represent not just historical evidence, but actual physical assets that legally belonged to victims' descendants. Exposing this wouldn't just damage the Harrington reputation. It could lead to millions in restitution claims against the family fortune. At 10:45 p.m., with the house fallen silent and dark, Rachel slipped out of her room. She wore the darkest clothing she owned, moving with the practiced silence that had served her in combat zones. The servants' staircase allowed her to bypass the motion sensors in the main hallways, bringing her to the attic entrance without triggering any alarms. The lock on the attic door was simple, yielding easily to her picking techniques. Inside, the vast space was transformed by moonlight streaming through the dormer windows, casting long shadows across the organized piles she'd created during her days of work. The Bavarian trunk sat where it had always been, its brass fittings gleaming dully in the silvery light. Rachel approached it with reverence, understanding that she was potentially about to uncover evidence of historical crimes that had never been brought to justice. The trunk's lock was more sophisticated than the doors had been, but still within her capabilities. After several tense minutes of careful manipulation, she felt the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The trunk's heavy lid opened silently on well-maintained hinges, revealing contents that immediately confirmed her worst suspicions. Nestled in custom compartments lined with velvet were dozens of gold bars, each stamped with serial numbers and German markings. Alongside them lay jewelry, wedding rings, necklaces, watches, the kind of personal valuables that Holocaust victims had been forced to surrender before being sent to concentration camps. A leather portfolio contained documentation that left no room for doubt. Inventories of items taken from specific Jewish families, transfer papers showing how these assets had been moved through Swiss banks into Harrington control, and photographs documenting the original owners' faces of Holocaust victims, whose final indignity had been the theft of their family treasures. Most damning of all was a series of letters between Harrington Sr. and a high-ranking SS officer, detailing their arrangement for transferring looted assets to America in exchange for a percentage of their value. The correspondence continued into 1945, showing how the banker had helped Nazi officials prepare for defeat by hiding their stolen wealth. "It's called Operation Safekeep," a voice said from the darkness, causing Rachel to spin around in shock. Eleanor Harrington stood in the attic doorway, a small revolver held steadily in her hand. "That was my father-in-law's code name for it. Moving the assets of the Reich to safe hands before the Allies could seize everything." Rachel stared at Eleanor, her military training instantly assessing the situation. The elderly woman held the revolver with surprising steadiness, not the trembling grip of someone unused to firearms, but the practiced stance of someone with experience. The gun was a vintage Colt .38, likely from the same era as the Nazi loot surrounding them. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "Operation Safekeep," Rachel repeated, keeping her voice calm, while her mind raced through possible scenarios. "So your father-in-law wasn't just doing business with Nazis. He was actively helping them hide stolen assets." Eleanor's aristocratic features hardened in moonlight. "History is written by the winners, Miss Calloway. My father-in-law understood that wars end, but wealth endures. He provided a service and was compensated accordingly." "A service?" Rachel couldn't keep the disgust from her voice. "These aren't just assets. These are wedding rings pulled from fingers before their owners were murdered. Family heirlooms stolen from people being loaded onto trains to death camps. I'm not interested in a moral lecture from a homeless veteran who broke into my private property," Eleanor replied coldly. "History is complicated. The Harrington legacy is built on recognizing opportunity where others see only tragedy." Rachel gestured toward the trunk's contents. "This isn't complicated. It's theft in collaboration with genocide." These items have rightful owners, descendants of Holocaust victims, who've been searching for their family treasures for decades. Eleanor's laugh was brittle. And you think exposing this would serve some greater justice? The legal battles alone would consume whatever value these items hold. The only people who would profit would be lawyers and publicity seekers. As they spoke, Rachel subtly shifted her stance, evaluating her options. The distance between them was approximately 15 feet too far to disarm Eleanor before she could fire, especially given the confined space and obstacles between them. She needed to keep the widow talking while looking for an opportunity. "Why keep it?" Rachel asked. "You must know how dangerous this is. Why not sell everything and distance yourself from the evidence?" Something flashed across Eleanor's face, a complex emotion that suggested the question had struck a nerve. "These items are more valuable intact than separated. And contrary to what you might think, I'm not without conscience. I've made anonymous donations to Holocaust memorial organizations for years." "Conscience?" Rachel challenged. "You're sitting on millions in stolen property while Holocaust survivors died in poverty. Their grandchildren still fight for acknowledgement and restitution. That's not conscience, that's guilt maintenance." Eleanor's gun hand remained steady, but her expression revealed a flicker of defensiveness. "You don't understand the complexities. My late husband wanted to return these items, expose everything his father had done. That idealism nearly destroyed our family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What happened?" Rachel asked, genuinely curious now. The family dynamics had just become more complicated than she'd anticipated. Richard hired investigators to trace the original owners' families, Eleanor explained, her voice softening slightly at the mention of her husband. He found several living descendants. But before he could contact them, his father discovered what he was doing. The confrontation between them was violent. Richard was disinherited, threatened. His father warned that exposing the family's Nazi connections would result in complete financial ruin. Rachel saw an opening not physical, but psychological. Eleanor was revealing a family schism, a moral conflict that had never been resolved. But Richard died before he could make it right. Eleanor's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "A sailing accident," they called it. "I was never convinced. Richard was an expert sailor. The conditions that day weren't nearly dangerous enough to explain his drowning." The implication hung heavy in the attic air. Eleanor believed her father-in-law had murdered his own son to protect the family's dark secret. Whatever her own moral compromises, she had loved her husband and lost him to this trunk's contents. "And your son?" Rachel asked gently, remembering Miss Perry's mention of the Harringtons' only child dying young. "Thomas inherited his father's conscience," Eleanor said, grief momentarily overtaking her cold composure. "He found the documentation when he was in college, confronted me about it, demanded we make restitution. When I hesitated, not refusing, just asking for time to consider the implications, he threatened to go public himself." Rachel could see where this was leading. Another convenient accident? Eleanor's hand finally trembled, the gun wavering slightly. Brake failure on his car. The investigators found nothing suspicious, but Thomas was meticulous about vehicle maintenance. Like his father, he wasn't careless. The pieces were falling into place. Eleanor Harrington wasn't just protecting family wealth or reputation. She was trapped in a generational tragedy she believed had claimed both her husband and son. Whether her suspicions about their deaths were accurate or paranoid fantasies born of guilt, the psychological prison was real. "So you've been protecting this secret alone for years," Rachel observed, "carrying the weight of what happened to your husband and son, making token donations to ease your conscience, but never taking the final step of returning what was stolen. What would you have me do?" Eleanor demanded, a hint of genuine desperation breaking through her aristocratic reserve. Expose everything now, decades later? Destroy the Harrington name that my husband and son died for, whether they wanted to or not? Allow their deaths to have been completely in vain? The revelation of Eleanor's internal conflict created both opportunity and complication. On one hand, her emotional vulnerability might provide an opening for Rachel to resolve the situation without violence. On the other, decades of suppressed guilt and fear had created a psychological powder keg that made Eleanor unpredictable. "I think your husband and son would want justice," Rachel said carefully. "Not destruction justice. There's a difference between exposing everything in a way that only creates chaos and making restitution in a manner that honors victims while acknowledging human complexity." A distant clock chimed midnight, the sound barely reaching the attic. Eleanor's expression shifted again, calculation replacing emotional vulnerability. "And I suppose you see yourself as the instrument of that justice? A homeless veteran who stumbled upon this secret by chance?" Rachel recognized the deflection. For what it was an attempt to diminish her standing, to frame her as an opportunistic outsider rather than a legitimate moral agent. It was a tactic she'd seen before from powerful people confronted with their misdeeds. "My circumstances don't change the facts," Rachel replied firmly. "These items belong to Holocaust victims' families. Their suffering doesn't diminish with time. The justice they deserve doesn't expire." Eleanor's grip on the revolver tightened. "You have no idea what complications you're stumbling into. The Harrington connections extend far beyond this house. People who would go to extraordinary lengths to keep these origins buried. You mean people who benefited from Operation Safekeep?" Rachel asked, seizing on the implication. "Other American families and businesses who received Nazi assets through your father-in-law?" The widow's silence was confirmation enough. The trunk before them wasn't just evidence of one family's moral compromise, but potentially a thread that, if pulled, could unravel the carefully constructed mythologies of multiple prominent American dynasties. "This goes beyond us," Eleanor finally said. "Beyond this house, this town. There are names in those documents that appear on university buildings, hospital wings, museum galleries. Families whose foundations fund political campaigns on both sides of the aisle. The scandal wouldn't just affect me, it would undermine institutions that thousands depend on." Rachel understood the implied threat. Eleanor was suggesting that powerful people would silence anyone who threatened to expose these connections, just as she believed they had silenced her husband and son. Whether true or a convenient justification for inaction, the fear was clearly real to Eleanor. "So what now?" Rachel asked, gesturing toward the gun. "You shoot a homeless veteran and explain it as self-defense during a burglary? Add another. Death to those already connected to this trunk." Eleanor's face showed genuine conflict. "I don't want to harm you, Miss Calloway. Despite appearances, I'm not a violent person. But I cannot allow you to destroy everything with a simplistic crusade for justice that ignores the complexities of history and human choices." "Then let's find a third way," Rachel suggested, drawing on conflict resolution strategies she'd learned during reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan. One that acknowledges both the victim's rights to restitution and the complicated human reality of how we got here. Eleanor's expression showed skeptical interest. "What exactly are you proposing?" Rachel gestured toward the trunk. "Documented restitution, administered through a trusted third party. The Holocaust Museum has protocols for returning looted assets to verified descendants while maintaining anonymity for the current holders if necessary. No press conferences, no public scandal, just quiet justice for families who've waited generations." The proposal hung between them, a potential bridge across moral divides. For a moment, Rachel thought she saw genuine consideration in Eleanor's eyes, flicker of the same conscience that had driven her husband and son to seek justice despite the cost. Then the moment shattered as heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs, followed by a man's voice calling, "Mrs. Harrington? Is everything all right?" The security system showed motion in the attic. Eleanor's momentary vulnerability vanished, replaced by the cold calculation of self-preservation. "In here, Mr. Vaughn, and bring your associates. We have an intruder." 3 men entered the attic, not local police, but private security, their bearing and vigilance marking them as former military or law enforcement. The leader, presumably Vaughn, assessed the situation with professional detachment, noting the open trunk, Eleanor's gun, and Rachel standing amid the evidence of historical crimes. "Miss Calloway has been conducting unauthorized exploration of family heirlooms," Eleanor explained, her aristocratic composure fully restored. "Please escort her from the property immediately. Her employment is terminated." Rachel recognized the tactical disadvantage immediately. 3 trained security professionals against 1 unarmed woman in a confined space offered no viable resistance options. More importantly, Eleanor was offering her a way out: dismissal rather than prosecution or worse. "Mrs. Harrington," Rachel said carefully, aware that her next words might determine whether she walked out of Rosewood Manor alive. "Think about what your husband and son wanted. Think about the weight you've carried all these years." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, a momentary connection, an acknowledgement of the truth they both now shared. Then it was gone, replaced by the impenetrable mask of privilege and power. "Take her belongings to the gate," Eleanor instructed the security team. "Ensure she leaves the property immediately." 20 minutes later, Rachel stood at the ornate gates of Rosewood Manor, her backpack containing everything she owned slung over one shoulder. The security team had been professionally efficient, neither rough nor sympathetic, simply executing their employer's orders with practiced detachment. The night air was cold, the hour late, and her prospects non-existent. She was once again homeless, now without even the temporary shelter job that had briefly offered stability. Worse, she had discovered evidence of historical crimes but been powerless to do anything about it. The gold bars, the jewelry, the documentation, all would likely be moved or destroyed now that Eleanor knew her secret had been discovered. As Rachel contemplated her next steps, a sleek black car approached the gates from inside the property. It stopped beside her, and the passenger window lowered to reveal Eleanor Harrington's composed features. "Get in, Miss Calloway," the widow sighed, her tone neither friendly nor hostile. "We have more to discuss." Rachel hesitated, weighing the risks. Getting into a car with someone who had recently pointed a gun at her violated every security protocol she'd ever learned. Yet walking away meant abandoning any chance of justice for the Holocaust victims whose stolen property filled that Bavarian trunk. "Why should I trust you?" Rachel asked directly. Eleanor's expression remained unreadable. "Because despite everything, I loved my husband and son. And because carrying this secret alone for decades has become unbearable." The admission of vulnerability from this proud, wealthy woman was unexpected. Rachel made her decision and got into the car, maintaining situational awareness and noting potential escape routes, habits from her military days that had become second nature. They drove in silence through the sleeping town, eventually arriving at a small, nondescript building on the outskirts, the local office of Harrington Trust and Investment, according to the discreet sign. Eleanor used a key card to access the building, leading Rachel to a conference room with no windows, a space designed for maximum privacy. "What I'm about to show you exists in only 3 copies," Eleanor said, retrieving a leather portfolio from a hidden wall safe. "My husband created this documentation before his death. It's a complete inventory of every item in the Bavarian trunk, traced back to its original owners where possible, with genealogical research identifying living descendants." She spread the contents across the conference table meticulously. Organized records showing years of private investigation. The work was extraordinary in its detail and compassion. Richard Harrington had not only identified the stolen items, but had worked to understand the human stories behind them, family photographs, Biographical details, notes about cultural and personal significance of specific pieces. Richard believed that restitution wasn't just about returning valuable objects, Eleanor explained, her voice softer now. It was about acknowledging the lives that were destroyed, the families torn apart. He wanted to return these items with full understanding of what they meant to their original owners. Rachel examined the documents with growing respect for the man who had created them. This is remarkable work. Your husband was clearly deeply committed to making this right. He was a good man born into a corrupt legacy, Eleanor said simply. After his death, I told myself I was protecting his memory by keeping his work secret. But in truth, I was protecting myself from the implications of what he'd discovered, not just about his father, but about our entire social circle. The connections to Nazi wealth run deep in this town, this state, this country. Rachel looked up from the documents. So why show me this now? Why not have your security team drive me to the bus station and be done with it? Eleanor's aristocratic features showed genuine conflict. Because you said something in the attic that I haven't been able to dismiss. About my husband and son not wanting destruction but justice. About finding a way to make restitution without creating chaos that serves no one. The Holocaust Museum. Protocol, Rachel nodded, understanding now. Is that real? Eleanor asked. A genuine possibility? Restitution without public scandal that would only create more pain while lining lawyers' pockets. Rachel nodded. Very real. I worked with their recovery team during an intelligence operation in my last deployment. They have discrete channels, specifically designed for situations where people want to return Nazi-looted assets without publicity. The focus is on getting items back to rightful heirs, not public shaming of current holders. For the first time, Rachel saw something like hope in the elderly woman's eyes. And they would honor Richard's research? Ensure these items reach the specific families he identified. That's exactly what they do, Rachel confirmed. They validate the research independently, but their goal is connecting specific items with their rightful owners, not just adding artifacts to museum collections. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of a document that showed a pre-war photograph of a Jewish family in Vienna, standing proudly before their jewelry store, a family whose rings and watches now lay in the Bavarian trunk. I've lived with this burden for decades, she finally said. Convinced myself that keeping the secret was protecting Richard's and Thomas's memory. But perhaps I've had it backward all this time. Perhaps the true way to honor them is to finish what they started. Rachel felt the historical weight of the moment, a potential turning point that could bring closure to dozens of Holocaust survivor families after more than half a century of loss and searching. It won't be simple, Rachel cautioned. The process takes time. There will be legal complexities, verification procedures. But it can be done discreetly, with dignity for all involved. Eleanor's expression showed the internal struggle between decades of secrecy and the possibility of redemption. And your role in this? What do you want in return for your silence about how you discovered this? The question wasn't surprising, but it still stung. Eleanor was assuming that Rachel, like everyone else in her wealthy social circle, would leverage this knowledge for personal gain. Justice doesn't have a price tag, Rachel replied firmly. I don't want payment for basic human decency. What I want is for these items to reach their rightful owners. What I need is a job and a place to live while I rebuild my life. Those are separate matters. Eleanor studied her with new interest, perhaps seeing Rachel clearly for the first time, not just as a homeless veteran or potential threat, but as someone whose moral compass remained intact despite personal hardship. Then perhaps we can help each other, Eleanor said finally. The Harrington Foundation has a veterans housing initiative that's been looking for a program director, someone with first-hand understanding of the challenges veterans face. The position includes an apartment in the foundation building. The offer was unexpected but not unwelcome, Rachel had experience with veteran support programs from both sides, as a provider during her service and as a recipient afterward. Using that knowledge to help others while stabilizing her own situation seemed like a meaningful path forward. And the restitution? Rachel pressed, unwilling to be distracted from the central moral issue. "We'll begin immediately," Eleanor promised. "Together. You with your Holocaust Museum connections, me with Richard's research and the necessary resources. We'll return everything to its rightful owners, honor my husband's and son's memory properly, and perhaps find some measure of peace in the process." As dawn light began to filter through the building's windows, Rachel considered the unlikely alliance being offered. Eleanor Harrington was not suddenly transformed into a moral paragon. She remained a privileged woman who had protected family, wealth built on theft and genocide for decades. Yet she was also someone who had lost her husband and son to the same dark legacy she had protected, someone who might genuinely want redemption in her final years. "One condition," Rachel stipulated. "Complete transparency. I need to be involved in every step of the restitution process to ensure nothing is hidden or withheld." Eleanor nodded with unexpected grace. "Agreed. Perhaps it's time someone held the Harrington legacy to account. It might have saved my husband and son if someone had done so sooner." They shook hands across the table, the homeless veteran and the wealthy widow, united by an unexpected discovery in an attic and a shared commitment to addressing a historical injustice that had shaped both their lives in profoundly different ways. The journey ahead would be complex, the moral terrain challenging to navigate. But as Rachel looked at the documentation of lives destroyed and treasures stolen, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving the military: a clear mission, with purpose and meaning, a chance to bring justice to those who had waited far too long. 6 months after their unlikely alliance formed, Rachel Calloway stood beside Eleanor Harrington in the private conference room of the Holocaust Museum's Restitution Department in Washington, D.C. Before them, laid carefully on acid-free archival paper, was a gold pocket watch that had once belonged to Joseph Goldstein, a Viennese jeweler who had perished at Auschwitz along with his wife. Their youngest daughter, however, had escaped to America through the Kindertransport program before the borders closed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His granddaughter lives in Chicago, Dr. Miriam Cohen, the museum's chief restitution officer, explained as she prepared the documentation. She's 79 now, has 3 children, 7 grandchildren. When we contacted her about the watch, she broke down crying. Said her mother spoke of this watch her entire life, how her father would let her wind it every Sunday evening as a special treat. Rachel glanced at Eleanor, noting the conflicting emotions on the elderly widow's face: shame at her family's role in the theft, relief at the impending restitution, and something more complex that might have been a form of healing. This was the 17th item they had returned in their methodical journey through the contents of the Bavarian trunk. "Mrs. Goldstein will be arriving momentarily," Dr. Cohen continued. "As with the previous restitutions, she has agreed to the confidentiality terms. She knows only that the item was recently discovered in a private collection and is being returned voluntarily." Eleanor nodded, her aristocratic composure intact but her eyes revealing the emotional weight of these moments. "Will she stay to hear the history of the piece? Some families prefer not to know the details." "She specifically requested the full provenance," Dr. Cohen replied. "She's a Holocaust educator herself. Uses her family story in her work with high school students." Rachel felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied these restitution ceremonies. Each one represented a small piece of justice in a historical atrocity that could never be fully remedied. Each family's reaction was different. Some preferred clinical efficiency. Others needed to share stories of the relatives who had owned these treasures, Still others broke down at this tangible connection to loved ones lost decades ago. When Sarah Goldstein entered the room, a dignified woman with silver hair, and her grandfather's eyes according to the family photographs they had studied, Rachel stepped back, allowing Eleanor to experience the moment fully. This had become their pattern. Rachel coordinated the logistics of each restitution, while Eleanor faced the direct descendants of those her family had wronged. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The meeting followed the now familiar protocol. Dr. Cohen explained the provenance of the watch, how it had been confiscated during the Aryanization of Jewish businesses in Vienna in 1938, recorded in Nazi inventory lists, and eventually transferred to American control through what the museum neutrally termed private channels during the post-war period. Eleanor, identified only as the current holder, formally renounced any claim to the item. Then came the moment that never failed to move Rachel, regardless of how many times she witnessed it. Sarah Goldstein held her grandfather's watch for the first time, running her fingers over the monogram he had engraved on the case, opening it to reveal the family photograph hidden inside, her mother as a child, her grandparents in their wedding clothes, a family immortalized before tragedy struck. "My mother used to describe this watch in such detail," Sarah said, her voice steady but her eyes glistening. "How the case felt warm because my grandfather kept it in his vest pocket. How it ticked with a slight hesitation every seventh beat, something only family would notice. She was right about that. I can hear it now." Eleanor remained silent, her composed facade beginning to crack as Sarah shared stories about the grandfather, who had crafted fine timepieces for Austrian aristocracy, who had taught his daughters to appreciate precision and beauty, who had sent his youngest child to safety while believing he and his wife would somehow survive. The watch wasn't the valuable part, Sarah explained. It was what it represented, his craft, his pride in perfect timing. He used to say that a well-made watch was humanity's humble attempt to capture something divine, the perfect measurement of life passing. She looked up from the timepiece. "Thank you for returning this piece of my family's soul." Later, as they left the museum for their hotel, Rachel noticed Eleanor's unusual silence. The restitution ceremonies always affected her deeply, but today's seemed to have struck a particular chord. "You're thinking about your husband," Rachel observed as they walked through the crisp autumn air. Eleanor nodded, her typical reserve softened by emotion. Richard would have appreciated today's ceremony. He always said that restitution wasn't about the monetary value, but about restoring connections, allowing families to reclaim the physical touchstones of their history. Over the past 6 months, their working relationship had evolved into something neither woman had anticipated, not quite friendship, but a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Eleanor had kept her word about transparency, granting Rachel full access to the restitution process and providing the promised position with the Harrington Foundation's Veterans Program. The apartment included in the job package had given Rachel her first stable housing in years. The regular income had allowed her to resume treatment for her PTSD with a private therapist who specialized in combat trauma. Slowly, methodically, she was rebuilding her life while helping other veterans find their own paths to stability. But the restitution work remained their core connection. Together, they had developed a system for tracing the rightful owners of every item in the Bavarian trunk. Richard Harrington's research provided the foundation, but many families had moved multiple times since his initial investigations. Finding current descendants often required painstaking genealogical work across multiple countries. 27 items returned so far, Rachel noted as they entered their hotel. 43 to go. At this rate, we should complete the process within 18 months. Eleanor's expression suggested she was contemplating something beyond their established timeline. "There's something we need to discuss. Would you join me for dinner in my suite?" 2 hours later, over a meal provided by the hotel's room service, Eleanor revealed what had been weighing on her mind. The Bavarian trunk isn't the only collection of Nazi assets in Harrington possession. Rachel set down her fork, her full attention captured by this revelation. What are you saying? Richard's father, my father-in-law, was more deeply involved in Operation Safekeep than even Richard realized. Eleanor explained, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. There are additional caches in 3 separate locations. Bank vault in Switzerland, a storage facility in New York, and another trunk in our summer house on Cape Cod. The scale of the revelation was staggering. If these additional collections were similar to the Bavarian trunk, they were looking at hundreds more stolen items, potentially millions in gold, jewelry, artwork, and other valuables taken from Holocaust victims. Why tell me this now? Rachel asked, her mind already calculating the expanded scope of their restitution efforts. Eleanor's aristocratic features showed uncharacteristic vulnerability. Because I received a diagnosis last week, pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors. Give me perhaps 6 months. The news hit Rachel with unexpected force. Despite their complicated beginning, she had come to respect Eleanor's commitment to making amends for her family's crimes. The woman sitting across from her wasn't simply a wealthy widow, protecting ill-gotten gains. She was someone actively working to right historical wrongs, whatever her initial motivations had been. I'm sorry, Rachel said simply. Eleanor acknowledged the sympathy with a slight nod. I've revised my will to create a trust dedicated specifically to continuing the restitution process. You would serve as its executor, working with the Holocaust Museum to ensure every item reaches its rightful owners. The responsibility being offered was enormous, not just financially but morally. Eleanor was essentially asking Rachel to become the custodian of justice for hundreds of Holocaust victims' families. Why me? Rachel asked directly. You have lawyers, financial advisors, people you've known for decades. Eleanor's gaze was unflinching. Because you were willing to sleep at a homeless shelter rather than compromise your principles. Because when you discovered what was in that trunk, your first thought wasn't how to profit from it, but how to return it to the rightful owners. Because you understand both the moral imperative and the practical complexities of this work. The trust would provide Rachel with financial security and meaningful purpose for years to come. More importantly, it would ensure that the restitution process continued even after Eleanor's death, potentially bringing closure to hundreds of Holocaust survivor families who had spent decades searching for their stolen heritage. There's something else, Eleanor continued, retrieving a folder from her briefcase. Information about other American families involved in Operation Safekeep. Richard compiled this research separately, understanding its explosive potential. These are prominent names: banking families, industrial dynasties, people whose philanthropy has shaped American cultural and political institutions. Rachel examined the documentation with growing concern. The list included surnames that appeared on university buildings, museum wings, and political donor lists, families whose public images were built on careful mythologies about their wealth's origins. What do you want me to do with this? She asked, understanding the dangerous territory they were entering. Eleanor's expression reflected the same moral calculation she had wrestled with for decades. That will be your decision after I'm gone. The trust gives you the authority to approach these families privately, offering them the same opportunity for discreet restitution that we've undertaken, or to make the information public if they refuse to acknowledge their moral obligations. The power being placed in her hands was sobering. You're asking me to become judge and jury for some of America's wealthiest families. I'm asking you to be the conscience my husband and son tried to be, Eleanor corrected gently. To offer redemption first, but to demand accountability when it's refused. Over the following weeks, as they continued the restitution process, from the Bavarian trunk, Eleanor's health declined rapidly. The cancer progressed more aggressively than even her doctors had predicted, leaving her increasingly frail but no less determined to establish the framework that would continue after her death. Legal documents were finalized, transferring control of the hidden Nazi assets to the trust Rachel would oversee. The Holocaust Museum agreed to provide institutional support and expertise for the expanded restitution efforts. Everything was being methodically prepared for the transition. Neither woman had anticipated 6 months earlier when they first formed their unlikely alliance. On a cold December morning, as they prepared for a restitution ceremony involving a silver Kiddush cup being returned to a rabbi's family in Brooklyn, Eleanor collapsed in her hotel room. Rachel called an ambulance, but by the time they reached the hospital, it was clear that Eleanor had days rather than weeks remaining. "No hospital," Eleanor insisted, her voice weakened but her will undiminished. "Take me home to Rosewood. There are things I need to show you before the end." Against medical advice, but with hospice support, Rachel arranged for Eleanor's return to the mansion where their story had begun. The grand house that had once intimidated her now felt like a repository of unfinished business, a physical manifestation of the moral complexity they had navigated together. In Eleanor's final days, she revealed the locations and access protocols for the additional Nazi assets, transferred the remaining legal authorities to Rachel, and shared the full story of her family's entanglement with historical evil not as justification but as context for the work that would continue after she was gone. "I was complicit through silence," Eleanor acknowledged as they sat in her bedroom overlooking the gardens of Rosewood Manor. "For decades, I told myself I was protecting Richard's and Thomas's memory by keeping their deaths from being associated with scandal. But I was really protecting myself from having to confront the source of my privilege." Rachel, who had seen both the best and worst of humanity during her military service, understood the complex terrain of moral compromise better than most. "You're making it right now. That counts for something." "Not enough," Eleanor replied, with the clarity of someone facing imminent mortality. "But it's what I can offer at this late stage. The trust will ensure the work continues, but there's something else I want you to do, something personal." From her bedside table, she retrieved a small box containing a simple gold wedding band. This belonged to Elise Bergman, a young woman from Berlin who died at Ravensbrück. Her fiancé, David Hoffman, survived Buchenwald and eventually emigrated to Israel. He spent decades searching for this ring, the last connection to the woman he loved. Eleanor's hands trembled as she passed the box to Rachel. "David died 3 years ago, still searching. But his grandson, Aaron, lives in Tel Aviv. He's continued his grandfather's quest as an act of devotion to a woman he never met, but whose story shaped his family's history. I want you to deliver this personally, not through the museum protocol, but face to face. Tell him the full story of how it was taken and how it's being returned." The request represented a significant departure from their established procedure of anonymous restitution. Eleanor was asking Rachel to become not just the facilitator of justice, but its human face, to accept both the judgment and potential forgiveness of a Holocaust victim's family. Eleanor Harrington died peacefully 3 days later, with Rachel at her bedside. The official obituary described her as a philanthropist dedicated to veterans' causes and historical preservation. Only Rachel and a small circle of Holocaust Museum officials knew the full story of her final months, how the wealthy widow had worked to return millions in Nazi-looted assets to their rightful owners after decades of protecting her family's dark secret. Following the funeral, which was attended by Boston's social elite, largely unaware of the moral reckoning that had occupied Eleanor's final months, Rachel began implementing the expanded restitution plan. The trust was now active, providing both the resources and legal framework to continue returning stolen items to Holocaust victims' families for years to come. 2 weeks later, Rachel found herself in Tel Aviv, sitting across from Aaron Hoffman, in a small apartment filled with books and family photographs. At 42, he was a professor of Holocaust studies at Tel Aviv University. His academic work shaped by his grandfather's experiences and his family's losses during the Shoah. "My grandfather spoke of this ring every day of his life," Aaron said as he held the simple gold band that had traveled from Nazi Germany to Eleanor Harrington's attic and finally to its rightful place. He and Elise had purchased matching bands the week before she was arrested. He wore his through his entire time at Buchenwald, somehow managing to keep it hidden. Hers was confiscated when she was processed at Ravensbrück. As instructed by Eleanor, Rachel shared the full story, not just of the ring's journey, but of her own discovery in the attic, Eleanor's initial threat and subsequent change of heart, and the broader restitution effort now underway. She held nothing back, neither minimizing the Harrington family's complicity, nor overstating Eleanor's late-life attempts at atonement. Aaron listened in silence, his expression revealing the complex emotions that accompanied this moment of closure after 3 generations of searching. When Rachel finished, he studied her face with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating historical testimony. "You know, in Judaism, we have a concept called teshuvah, repentance," he said finally. "True teshuvah isn't just saying sorry. It requires acknowledging the wrong, making restitution when possible, and changing future behavior." "What you and Mrs. Harrington began, what you're continuing now, it's a form of teshuvah for crimes neither of you personally committed, but from which her family benefited." He placed the ring carefully in a small display case that already contained his grandfather's matching band, the separated pairs finally reunited after more than 80 years. "My grandfather always said that the most important thing was not the ring itself, but the acknowledgement, someone admitting what was taken and why. The Nazis didn't just steal objects. They stole history, identity, connection. Returning these items restores something beyond their material value." As she left Aaron's apartment that evening, Rachel felt the weight of the responsibility she had inherited. The trust would occupy her for years, perhaps decades, a mission of historical justice that would bring her into contact with hundreds of Holocaust survivor families across the world. Each restitution would represent a small measure of healing in a historical wound that could never fully close. Walking through Tel Aviv's evening streets, Rachel reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought her from homelessness to this moment of meaningful purpose. The trauma that had once defined her life hadn't disappeared. She still had nightmares, still struggled with crowded spaces, still carried the invisible wounds of combat. But now those challenges existed alongside something healing work that honored both the victims of historical crimes and her own commitment to justice. Back in her hotel room, Rachel opened her laptop to review the next set of restitution cases awaiting her attention. The list was long, each item representing both a historical injustice and an opportunity for belated healing. The task before her was daunting, but for the first time since leaving the military, she felt equipped for the mission, not despite her broken places but because of them. Her experiences as a homeless veteran had given her intimate understanding of how systems fail vulnerable people. Her military training had provided the discipline and strategic thinking needed for complex, long-term operations. Even her PTSD, with its heightened awareness of moral complexities, had prepared her for navigating the ethical terrain of historical reckoning. 6 months earlier, she had been sleeping in a shelter, her military medals stored in a backpack under her cot. Her future a blank void of survival rather than purpose. Now she was the executor of a multi-million-dollar trust dedicated to Holocaust restitution, with a mission that would touch hundreds of families across multiple continents. The journey had begun with a chance assignment to clean a wealthy widow's attic, a seemingly random connection that had evolved into something neither woman could have anticipated. Whatever Eleanor Harrington's initial motivations, whatever moral compromises she had made throughout her life, her final act had been to entrust a homeless veteran with completing the work her husband and son had died trying to begin. "Rachel!" Turn to the next case file, a collection of rare books stolen from a prominent Jewish intellectual's library in Warsaw. Somewhere in the world, his grandchildren were still searching for these volumes that represented their family's scholarly legacy. Thanks to the unlikely partnership forged in that attic 6 months ago, they would soon hold these treasures in their hands, closing a circle of loss and recovery that had remained open for more than 3 generations. As she worked into the night, preparing the documentation for the next restitution ceremony, Rachel understood that she had found something more valuable than stable housing or financial security. She had found purpose, a mission worthy of the same dedication she had once given to her military service, a cause that honored both the historical victims she was helping and the moral compass that had guided her through her darkest days. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.